Somewhere in the ancient city of Nineveh, in a library built for a king who believed knowledge was power, a scholar pressed a stylus into wet clay. He was not writing something new. He was copying something old, a story so old that no one alive could say when it had first been told. It was the story of a great flood, a man chosen, a boat, animals, water covering the earth, a bird sent out to find dry land. The king was Ashurbanipal. The year was somewhere around 650 BC, and the story he had ordered preserved was already ancient. When archaeologists pulled that clay tablet from the ruins of Nineveh in the 1850s, the world was not ready for what it said, because the story on the tablet was not from the Bible. It was older than any Bible anyone had ever read, and it described in remarkable detail events that readers of Genesis thought they already knew. The question that tablet raised has never gone away. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and what the ancient world surrounding it reveals about the oldest stories ever told. To understand Genesis, you have to understand the world it was compiled in. The ancient Near East, the vast sweep of land stretching from the Nile Valley in the west to the rivers of Mesopotamia in the east, was not a blank slate when the biblical writers set their words down. It was a world already dense with story, already crowded with creation myths and flood accounts and genealogies stretching back to the beginning of time. The civilizations of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, had been telling their own versions of the world's origins for thousands of years before the first books of the Hebrew Bible took the form we recognize today. This was a world of city-states and river kingdoms, of trade routes connecting Egypt to Anatolia, of scribal schools where young men memorized texts the way students today memorize equations. Writing was not casual, it was sacred. To commit something to clay or to scroll was to make it permanent. To make it permanent was to make it true in the deepest sense that ancient cultures understood. The Hebrew Bible did not emerge in isolation from this world. It emerged in the middle of it, shaped by the same intellectual currents, aware of the same ancient traditions and yet distinctly, unmistakably its own. Genesis is where that story begins. The first word of Genesis in Hebrew is Bereshit, in the beginning. It is one of the most recognizable openings in all of human literature. And for centuries, readers of Scripture have encountered those words as if they were the first time anyone had ever tried to describe the origin of everything. But the scribes who first heard those words read aloud would have known they were entering a conversation that was already very old. Across the ancient Near East, creation stories were not rare. They were everywhere. The Sumerians had theirs. The Egyptians had theirs, and the Babylonians had one of the most elaborate of all. A text scholars call the Enuma Elish, named for its opening words, "When on high." In this account, the god Marduk defeats a primordial sea monster named Tiamat, splits her body in two like a shellfish, and from her divided form creates the sky and the earth. Humanity is made from the blood of a slain god, created to do the labor the gods no longer wish to do. The Enuma Elish was not a distant curiosity. It was the civic and religious centerpiece of Babylon, recited publicly at the New Year festival, performed before the king, embedded in the cultural memory of a civilization that dominated the ancient Near East for centuries. And when scholars first read it alongside the opening chapters of Genesis, the structural similarities were striking. A formless void before creation, a separation of waters, light before the heavenly bodies, an ordered sequence of creative acts. These are not identical texts. Their theologies are profoundly different, but they share a vocabulary of ideas, a way of imagining the act of creation that reflects a common intellectual world. The same pattern of shared tradition, though from a different set of texts, appears with the flood. The Epic of Gilgamesh is among the oldest works of literature ever discovered. Its hero is a king of the city of Uruk, a real city, one of the earliest urban centers in human history, whose ruins still stand in what is now southern Iraq. In the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian version, a man named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of how he survived a great flood sent by the gods. He was warned in advance. He built a great vessel. He loaded it with animals and with craftsmen and with his family. The waters rose and covered the mountains. When they receded, he sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. He made an offering on a mountaintop. The gods smelled the offering and gathered around it. A still older text, the Atrahasis Epic, composed in Babylonian around the 17th century BC, tells a similar story. A man chosen, a flood decreed by the gods, a vessel built, humanity preserved. The flood tradition was not a single story with a single source. It was a current running through the entire ancient Near East, surfacing in different forms across centuries and cultures. The parallels with the Genesis account of Noah are detailed enough that when Gilgamesh Tablet 11 was first translated publicly in 1872 by a scholar named George Smith at the British Museum, the audience is said to have been so astonished that Smith reportedly left the room to collect himself. What do these parallels mean? Here, the channel's commitment to accuracy matters most. Popular accounts sometimes present the relationship as simple: Genesis borrowed from Babylon. But that is not what the evidence establishes, and it is not what most scholars today conclude. What the evidence establishes is that the ancient Near East shared a common stock of stories, a reservoir of cultural memory about origins, catastrophe, and humanity's place before the divine. These stories circulated across languages and borders for centuries, adapting as they traveled, shaped by the theology and priorities of each culture that retold them. The Genesis accounts are not copies of the Babylonian texts. They are distinct compositions that engage with the same deep questions, and engage with them very differently. Where the Enuma Elish presents creation as the aftermath of divine warfare, Genesis presents it as an ordered, intentional act of will. Where the flood accounts of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis attribute the flood to divine caprice, the gods flooded the earth partly because humanity had grown too noisy. Genesis presents it as a moral response to human wickedness. Where Utnapishtim receives immortality as his reward, Noah receives a covenant, a promise, a relationship, a set of obligations between humanity and God. The differences are as significant as the similarities, perhaps more so. Genesis does not confine itself to creation and flood. It is also a geographical document, and here the historical record has much to say. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 is one of the strangest passages in Scripture to a modern reader. A long genealogy that reads, on the surface, like a list of names. But scholars have long recognized that in the ancient world, genealogy was geography. The names in this table correspond with notable consistency to peoples and places known from the Iron Age Near East, the world of Israelite scribes writing during the Assyrian and Babylonian eras. Yavan is Ionia, Greece. Ashkenaz corresponds to the Scythians, a people who appear in Near Eastern records from the 7th century BC. Gomer aligns with the Cimmerians, another group attested in 1st millennium Assyrian records. Mitzrayim remains the Hebrew word for Egypt to this day. Then there is Abraham. Genesis 11 ends with a migration. Terach takes his family from Ur of the Chaldeans toward the land of Canaan. This is the pivot point on which the entire patriarchal narrative turns, the moment the story narrows from the whole world to a single family and a single promise. The Ur identified by most scholars with Abraham's origin is the ancient Sumerian city excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, a site of extraordinary wealth and complexity, home to a ziggurat still partially standing today, whose royal cemetery revealed treasures that reframed understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization. A minority of scholars propose a northern location, a city called Ura in the Harran region of what is now southeastern Turkey, but the southern identification remains the dominant position in scholarship. Woolley's Ur was a place of real grandeur, a city at the center of the ancient world. A family leaving it for Canaan would have been leaving one of the most sophisticated urban environments on earth. Whether Abraham himself is a historical individual is a question the archaeological record cannot currently answer. For much of the 20th century, scholars pointed to legal and social customs embedded in the patriarchal stories, frameworks for adoption, inheritance, and surrogacy, and compared them to documents recovered from the ancient sites of Nuzi and Mari, arguing these customs proved a 2nd millennium Bronze Age setting for the patriarchs. More recent scholarship, particularly from Thompson and Van Seters, has challenged that conclusion, arguing that these legal customs were not exclusive to the 2nd millennium but continued well into the Iron Age, meaning they cannot be used to pin the patriarchal narratives to a specific period. The question of when and how these stories were composed remains actively debated. What is not debated is that the world Genesis describes, its cities, its trade routes, its geography, is rooted in genuine knowledge of the ancient Near East. The most important thing archaeology has done for Genesis is not to confirm or deny specific events. It is to restore the text to its original context. For centuries, Genesis was read in isolation, as if it had arrived from outside history. The discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries placed it firmly inside history. Inside a world of competing cosmologies, established literary traditions, and genuine geographical knowledge that the text's authors clearly possessed. The creation traditions documented in the Enuma Elish and the flood traditions preserved in Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and the Atrahasis Epic established that these narratives were circulating in Mesopotamia across a long span of centuries. The Genesis accounts engage the same deep questions, but answer them in markedly different ways, and that divergence is itself historically significant. Woolley's excavations at Ur uncovered a thick deposit of water-laid sediment that he initially interpreted as evidence of the biblical flood. That interpretation has been revised significantly. The deposit is now understood as a local flooding event of limited geographical extent, not a universal inundation. The claim that archaeology has confirmed the flood of Noah is not supported by current consensus. What remains genuinely open is the question of Eden's geography. Genesis 2 describes 4 rivers flowing from a single source: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates are identifiable. The Pishon and Gihon are not. Proposals range from rivers in Arabia to arms of the Persian Gulf to purely symbolic geography. No identification commands scholarly consensus. The location of Eden, if it was ever a geographical location, remains unmapped. Genesis has provoked more argument, more wonder, and more sustained inquiry than perhaps any other text in human history. Empires have risen and fallen since it was first compiled. The intellectual landscape surrounding it has been transformed by philosophy, by science, by archaeology, and still the questions it asks refuse to go away. What the ancient world reveals about Genesis is not that the text is a simple echo of its neighbors. The clay tablets of Babylon and Nineveh show a world already wrestling with the same questions. Where did everything come from? Why do human beings suffer? What does a just God, or just gods, demand of the people they made? Genesis entered that conversation and answered it in a voice that was recognizably part of its world and yet unlike anything else in the ancient Near East. Every civilization that has ever existed has felt the need to explain where everything came from, why there is something rather than nothing, why the world can be both beautiful and devastating at once. Babylon had its answers. Egypt had its answers. And then there is this text, passed from hand to hand across 4,000 years, still being read, still being argued over, still refusing to be finished with. What it is exactly that keeps it alive is the question each reader has to answer for themselves. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.